Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for taking your time to come into this public lecture to discuss weathering future Indonesia-India cooperation, some recent insights. And of course, the issue that binds India and Indonesia this year together is the fact that we will both, and we had held an elections in respective countries. Of course, in general, 2024 is described as the biggest election year in history, where election will and had taken place in countries where nearly half of the world's population reside. And aside from various key states in the Indo-Pacific, such as the US and Taiwan, for example, Indonesia and India had and will have their respective elections as among two of the largest democracies in the world. Indonesia had just concluded its election on February the 14th, where up until now, the result speaks that Prabowo will likely be elected and for the next 5 years. And India will also have one, which will run from April to May 2024. And reading from the recent polls, I believe that Modi is seeing favorable results up until the point. And of course, when it comes to India and Indonesia, our relations date back to 2,000 years ago. And both countries has been a really reliable friend for each other in the global south. And speaking from the Indonesian audience, I believe that we have largely viewed India in a favorable perspective owing to its popular culture. And to discuss some of the recent developments in this between the in relations between the two countries, we have Dr. Satish Chandra Mishra. Dr. Satish Chandra Mishra is an economist and strategic thinker who received his training in Cambridge and Oxford with extensive experience in more than 40 countries in various regions and working with various major development agencies. And he is currently the managing director of Strategic Asia Indonesia and the director of Strategic Asia Global, which is a political economic consulting firm with extensive experience of works pertaining to China, India, and Indonesia. And he currently resides in Bali since 2016 and has since continued to work on various policy issues in ASEAN, including macroeconomic assessments for Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Laos. And of course, after his presentation, we will be having a Q&A session involving the audience. So I would like to encourage all of the participants to prepare your questions, whether you are attending offline or online. Of course, there are a lot of important topics to be discussed when it comes to Indonesia and India relations. So I believe that this discussion will be a fruitful one. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Mishra for your presentation. Dr. Mishra, you have 15 minutes, and you may begin your presentation. Please give a hand of applause to Dr. Mishra.
Okay. Well, it's been a busy 1 month. I had gone to India for 10 days, and I've returned after a month. I was supposed to go to 2 or 3 places to make presentations on Indonesia as well as on 1 or 2 other subjects. I ended up presenting in around 14. The first thing that impressed me was the amount of curiosity there was about Indonesia. And it was at every different level. I went all the way from university lectures up to the Prime Minister's office, to defense establishments, to Ministry of External Affairs seminars, and so on. And so there was a tremendous curiosity. And one of the reasons, one of the reasons that this proliferation, if you like, took place was because very early on, people began to realize that they absolutely knew nothing about Indonesia. And as I went along, it was clear to me that we were facing the same kind of knowledge deficit about India. And so I thought that today might be a good opportunity to start looking at some of the things that we talk about, or we are curious about, but our basic knowledge base, the kind of assumptions we make, even if some of the factual statements are just not correct. And the result is that in our thinking about each other, we often think in terms of black and white. And the situation is very gray. And I'll try to illustrate. What I'm going to do is the PowerPoint that I wrote up is really a set of notes that we should just circulate. And there's not much point in going through line by line this. And just to explain, I mean, if you ask people here, for example, about India-Indonesia relationship, and the same in Delhi, what you get is a whole series of recitations about agreements which have been signed, MOUs which have been negotiated, visits of officials and ministers that have been made, and so on. And then, of course, you learn about the G20. You'll hear about the maritime security exercises, etc., etc. But that's very much on the surface, and you get a sense that that is more a kind of a catalog of activities which don't really tell you much about the follow-up, the background, and so on. And so, in general, when I look around in Indonesia, essentially, we know quite a lot about Bollywood films. We know about the Taj Mahal. We know about the flood of Indian tourists to Bali, and of course, arranged marriages in India, which are still very popular. And a common view of Indians here is that they talk too much, listen too little, and are miserly in business. And I mentioned this in Delhi, that this is the impression, and and one of the things that you get from this is this extraordinarily poor state of knowledge about each other. Let me just give you some broad illustrations. The first is, for instance, that whenever we talk about India, except the people who are studying this, hardly anybody realizes the impact that the partition of India continues to have on Indian politics today. I won't go into the whole details about partition. It happened very quickly. The boundary lines were drawn very arbitrarily. And also, it was a strange case because India was a collection of British India and a series of princely states. And so they were dotted inside the main body of what we call India today. So Hyderabad, for instance, was a princely state. Many places in Gujarat and Punjab and so on, all over the place were princely states. And the princely states were given a choice to either accede to India or to Pakistan. And that created a major mess because suddenly in the middle of this big landmass, you'd have another country. And in the end, the partition was very, very bloody. And something like over 2 to 3 million people who had lived quite well side by side for a century or more, just ended up killing each other. And a lot of revenge killings and so on, because they had to migrate to another country, their property was taken over by somebody else, their land was taken over by people who were complete foreigners to the region. So, some of the issues that you see in India, whether it is religious, whether it is related to reservations for particular communities and so on, do go back to the porosity of the partition. And it's an important thing that we should know about, but we really don't. And it's a very, very strong influence. There's virtually no Indian family that I know of in North India, Northwestern India, and eastern parts of India, which doesn't have families, members who were killed or who were thrown out of their homes and so on. Now, look on the other side. If you ask the Indians, apart from the name Suharto, they have very little idea about how the new order functioned, why it collapsed, and the total control of the in Indonesian society that it managed to set up. The same applies, so there's a bit of history, if you like, but there's many other things, of course. In politics, it's the same thing. We are both democracies, but very different kinds of democracies. And again, we have very little knowledge about each other. And we keep on saying, you know, India is the world's largest democracy, and Indonesia is the world's third largest democracy, but there are huge differences which we are really not very aware of. For example, the Indian political system evolved from, was more or less inherited from the British. And that gave them a parliamentary system. There's no term limit on a prime minister, a bit like the UK, for instance. And some of the angst that is directed at the issue of term limits and so on is simply not there in countries which don't have those term limits. So that's just another kind of democracy. It's not a necessary property of any democracy that you've got to have term limits and so on. And we have lots of differences in that. Similarly, India is largely run by a civil service which is barely 5,000 people strong. And in fact, the so-called the Indian Administrative Service, which is like these are specially selected stream, if you like. There's only 2,500 of them, managing a country of 1.4 billion people. And that is very much the British system. And that has, in a sense, in many difficult crises, held the country together. But there's only 2,480 in the last count of them. And again, that's a very different story to what we have here. The Indian civil servants get rotated from one ministry to the other continuously. They are very much under the control of the political system. And of course, they can be transferred, and there are lots of stories about that. But the key thing is, India on a day-to-day level is governed by barely 2,500 people. And of course, we don't realize that. And that set up a whole system of government and machinery and special powers and so on that we don't have here. Similarly, in India, when people think about Islam, they always think in terms of Sunni and Shia. And nobody has a clue that here we have something called the Muhammadiyah or the Nadatul Ulama. Just comes as a surprise, even to the most senior people sitting around the table. And again, these are very fundamental building blocks when we have a conversation about each other, because they're part of the context, part of the systemic characteristics. Take another important issue, take language. We always keep saying that we have common origins in terms of Sanskrit. The old Javanese script looks very much like Devanagari, which was a Sanskrit script, so on. But what almost, virtually no Indian I met in this last visit who actually knows that Sukarno actually set up a national language called Bahasa Indonesia, which was an amalgam, and actually contributed to holding the country together. In India, on the other hand, in the 50s, the provinces were divided by linguistic lines, and there were a lot of young people who actually put petrol over themselves and burned themselves to death on the issue of language. So again, each one of these fairly simple but vital bits of information are things that we don't have about each other, and that came across very, very strongly in the visit. One other thing was the whole issue of the role of military in politics. In India, military has never been a factor in politics, even from the time of independence. There are historical reasons for that, and the role that Gandhi played at that time, but it simply had not been a factor in politics. There has been not a single hint at an attempted coup. It's very much civilian controlled. There is no such thing as a military business. And the main issue then has been what your defense budget looks like. How do you locate a battalion composed of people from the south away from their own working, their home areas to somewhere else, and basically ways to train them and deploy them and so on. But it has not been a business, it has not been in government, and there is no issue of Dui Fungsi or things like that. There is some talk of military being brought in to help with the rice harvest or something else, but that is done strictly under the control of the civilian authorities and in a situation where they're not considered to be a threat. Okay, so basic information we don't have about each other. And now, if you take the judiciary, for example, on the whole, the judiciary is independent. There have been times where it's been under pressure, but again, the court system works, and even in the case of very high-profile cases like the Babri Masjid, which was demolished to build a temple on the argument that before the masjid there was a temple, and then people keep going back for hundreds of years. The point is that there was a 9-year legal process, and only when that was exhausted and the Supreme Court actually made the decision to grant an alternative piece of land to the Muslims in the area and to basically allow the land on which the Babri Masjid had stood to become the Ayodhya temple. But the point here was that there was a legal system. There were riots, there were all kinds of issues, but in the end, the actual building of the temple and so on happened, and this is what Modi and many of these people argue, that there was a legal process. It's not just ignored. Now, the interesting thing about India, of course, is that despite this orderly democracy with a professional civil service, a military out of politics, etc., there's a huge amount of political polarization in India, and that's another feature very different to Indonesia. For example, there has always been a left-wing and a right-wing divide. In fact, several states of India were actually ruled for years by communist parties of different kinds. West Bengal was ruled by almost close to 25 years or 30 years by the Marxist Communist Party of India. The same was true of Kerala in the south. Similarly, ethnic parties have ruled provinces in India for decades. So when you look at and India is a federal structure, when you look at that mix, there is a tremendous amount of electoral violence. There's a lot of social conflict. A lot of people get killed. But the elections go on. The military has not taken over. It's not used this as an excuse. And even those areas where there has been considerable violence, two things happens. One is that the Indian president has a power to dissolve a provincial government and on the prime minister's recommendation to declare almost a martial law for a particular period, usually 6 months, and then extended until new elections are called and so on. So there is a fail-safe mechanism there. So again, on the political system, we have very little idea of each other, and that makes a big difference, because when we are trying to have a policy discussion, when we are trying to predict what particular conversations actually mean, without that context, without that knowledge, we simply don't get the full picture. Now, if I look at, I'll just go over this very quickly, and clearly in our case it's a very different story, because we do have a presidential term limit. We don't need to have a overall parliamentary majority to choose the head of state, or the head of government rather. In India, you have to have the majority in order to choose the prime minister. Here, the president is elected separately, and of course, in order to pass laws, you need to have a majority, but you don't need that in order to be president, for example. The level of decentralization is dramatically different. And I told friends in India that if they decentralize at the level of Indonesia, it'll be like governing India with 540 odd provinces, and everybody gasped and so on. But that's a completely different level of. The other big difference, of course, with us is that we don't have a left-right divide, partly because many of the people on the left were just wiped out in the 60s. And the big divide here has really been between shades of Islam and what your attitude to Sharia is and so on. But there hasn't been a polarization in a way that makes it easier to consolidate democracy earlier. But again, we didn't have that. So in our case, we have a lot of transactional politics. The political parties also don't have a very clear agenda and so on. And so this is one of the things that in India people didn't know, and when I presented it, they were very curious and they wanted to know how is it that Indonesia had actually managed to have such a low level of violence compared to what the Indians were used to, why polarization was so little, and so on and so on. This I think I've gone to already. Now, the important thing here is also, the one thing I forgot to say is in terms of civil service, professional services are recruited also along subjects. So you have overall administrative service, but you also have the economic service, you have the statistics service, you have specialized professional services, where people also sit centralized exams and allocate them for particular services. But one important fact there is that the Union Public Service Commission, which is responsible for setting these exams, only recruits 180 officers for whole of India. So you can see how elite this force actually is, and they are permanent. They very difficult to sack them, and they basically are very much like the British civil service in terms of authority and in terms of now. Okay, so that's a bit of the background to show that our knowledge of each other is rather poor. One of the insights that, apart from just this lack of knowledge that I felt that I got during this last visit, was that there's a tremendous increase in self-confidence in India at every level. If you go to people of different professions, if you go to the universities, if you go to social occasions, and so on. And of course, different ethnic groups, religious groups have tremendous differences. But nevertheless, compared to previous visits that I've made, there's been a tremendous increase in self-confidence. And part of it is also that, like Indonesia, in the last decade at least, economic growth rates have been high, and there's a target in a sense that Indonesia says it will be the 6th or 5th largest economy by the mid-30s, or if not earlier. India seems to be on track to be a 7.3 or 7.2 trillion economy by 2030, making it the 3rd largest economy globally. And if you look at Pricewaterhouse and so on, it seems that Indonesia will then be the next in line to that. So for the first time, you've got 3 Asian countries, China, India, and Indonesia, who are projected now to become the largest economies in the world, with the USA at the top there. So again, I see a tremendous amount of self-confidence. The other thing that is very obvious in India now is that they see themselves as a major global knowledge pool, because the Indian diaspora is about 38 million people. And so they say, well, you know, a lot of countries have aging populations and so on, and we can provide the skills that are necessary to run almost their engineering system and health systems and whatever. And again, that is seen to be a major asset. The Indian government has been quoting the Indian diaspora much more aggressively than it have done. One other aspect of this change of self-confidence is illustrated in the foreign minister's latest book called Why Bharat Matters. The term Bharat is now being used by the Modi government to refer to India, and that was the original name that the Indians used to refer to themselves. You know, and of course for us it means whoever is in the West, and of course Bharat is, if you use that name, is also in the west of Indonesia. So Jayashankar's book, Why Bharat Matters, one of the interesting things that they're saying is that India is a rising power, and as a rising power and a global power in a multipolar world, what kind of adjustments do you have to make? And so they're very busy, you know, having taken as given that they're going to be this major global power, is how they should navigate a multipolar world, whether it should be leaning towards the West and the Middle East, what should be their relationship with ASEAN, what should be their relationship with Russia, etc. So a lot of the concern is about that in terms of how they project themselves globally. And one of the things that this is one of the particular strange characteristics of the Modi government, is that they keep quoting the Ramayana and the Mahabharata at every conceivable occasion. And Jayashankar was a very sophisticated guy. If you read his book, every chapter has suddenly a side, like a box, which is something from the Ramayana. So it's a kind of lesson coming from Ramayana. And the reason is that they feel that the civilizational, you know, characteristics of each country are important. And in this case, this is the civilizational background of India. And so why not use some of the lessons that are learned from there to talk about foreign policy today. I think it's strange, but that's how it is. In terms of economic growth, I'll go through this quickly. The broad thing is that the per capita income of Indonesia is almost exactly double that of India. So Indonesia is a much richer country. But in terms of poverty alleviation, again, high growth has meant a very sharp decrease in poverty. But there are huge interprovincial differences, inter-community differences, and even differences across different professions. So inequality remains a massive problem. But the other side is that India has also seen an enormous increase in the number of international conglomerates. There is a serious class of Indian plutocrats which is emerging, which has already emerged. And again, some of these people have reinvested in India, but many of them have now broken free from India in a sense, are looking to global markets and so on and so on. So this is, again, at the top of the range. It's not like you have very nationalistic kind of Indian firms who have totally supported the Modi government and reinvesting, bringing capital back from abroad, investing in India and so on. That's not what's happened. But the range is impressive. Okay, now one other issue is, for example, there's a tremendous similarity in the kind of things that Indonesia is doing in the economics area and the Indians are doing. And that's probably true of many other middle-income countries. One is this massive push to build infrastructure, whether it's rail, road, metros, waterways, air transport, and all the rest. The second is this whole issue of smart cities and urbanization. Again, India has faced huge pressure towards urbanization. It's not as fast as as Indonesia, but it's still a very major part of the economic plank of the country. And in terms of specific focus, the big emphasis on digital infrastructure because India is strong in IT, in manufacturing, and in lots of startups, again, trying to use this human capital pool, and a whole series of facilities have been set up to promote startup firms and so on. One other thing which is again similar to us here is the growth of a new consuming or middle class, which of course is also huge. This year, globally, something like 113 million new consumers are supposed to have joined the consuming class, out of which about 80% comes from Asia. And in the Indian context, I'm just quoting some indicative data here, that you're really looking at 540 million people with annual consumption, income levels of $6,700 to $40,000. And the top income segment of this is about 90 million people. So this is an enormous market, and you see that in the economic buzz that you get in India, despite all its shortcomings. And so at the end of it is basically the feeling that India's time has come. It's a major emerging power. It can now dictate its own terms. It doesn't have to just accept whatever the Western powers wanted to do. And it picks and chooses alliances where it feels it has its own self-interest. Okay, now finally the business dimension. One of the interests between India and Indonesia is to promote business, promote trade, and trade has been increasing now. It's about $38 billion. And the target is to get it to go to about $100 billion. The issue here again is that there are a lot of disappointments. You know, when Salim invested in Calcutta, and there was a communist government there, the newspapers were full of reports were saying, well, Suharto's banker is now investing in communist Bengal, and and didn't go down too well. And Chiputra, the same thing. So in early period, investors from here got burnt, and the same thing has happened to many large Indian investors coming to Indonesia. So clearly there are a whole series of hurdles, but one of them is that neither of the group have ever bothered to have a serious market entry strategy. They simply go in, they're well known in their own countries, and they feel that therefore they're automatically known in another country. And that's same of Tatas, of Reliance, all series of very large Indian companies who've come to Indonesia and not done too well because of this. Now, one of the questions I want to end up with is something in which was a big elephant in the room. There was a massive interest in that, and it was always about the China question. You know, wherever I went, after all the discussion, the questions always came down to the first question, always about China. And the impression was, in many quarters, that in a way, you know, Indonesia has been taken over by China, and that you know, and it's a bit too late. We can't do much about it, and so, you know, it's going to be an uphill task. And one of the things I did in this visit was to try and unpack the whole China story, and and I'll just give you a gist of what I presented. Okay, so the first was there was this excitement about Jokowi going 5 times to Beijing. The fact that the Chinese had taken such an interest in the infrastructure investment, and especially in in Nusantara, the opening of the Wush Railway, etc., etc., etc. And all of that was, you know, supposed to be indication that Indonesia was very much in the Chinese thumbs, and you know, and some people go so far as to say that, well, you know, it actually belonged to China it's come to this, and I said that this was a ridiculous thing to say. And again, it was rooted in this complete lack of knowledge about some of the issues here. And so I pointed out that the ethnic Chinese only 3%, that there was a considerable antipathy to the Chinese in terms of general public opinion. The example of Ahok, for example. As far as infrastructure, investment, and Nusantara and issues like that went, the problem was quite simple, that hardly anybody can outcompete the Chinese in civil engineering bids and so on, because they build faster and cheaper than almost anybody else. And it was not that other people were prevented from coming in. The Indians didn't even show any interest in bidding because they thought they would never get anywhere. But the impression was somehow that there was somebody in the Chinese Communist Party office was actually spinning a massive conspiracy. And there was a very close connection between the Indonesian Chinese and mainland Chinese to kind of wield undue influence in the country. So I also pointed out that in fact you have a lot of investment from Japan, Korea, and a whole series of others. The other issue that I brought up, which resonated quite a bit, was the fact that one of the structural ways that you could actually reduce the influence of Chinese businesses here was actually to have a non-Chinese domestic business community. And one of the problems was that we really did not have much manufacturing capability. We didn't have a middle-level industry. So you had few supra-rich at the top and then everybody else in the middle. And by creating a integrated domestic market, as your middle class grew, you would now be able to grow that domestic business community, and that would be a way to reduce the influence of the Chinese and so on. So again, the domestic agenda there was very important, and they should understand that. And so not everybody was convinced, but I think that they were prepared to go back to the drawing board and look at this as a more less black and white and more a sort of gray area. Okay, let me now just close. Okay, so the last question that I raised there, and I'm raising it here again, is whether differences between these countries are such that really closer cooperation is just not possible. The first is the whole issue of Islam and Hindutva, which is the Hindu philosophy that Modi and his government has espoused. Now this is interesting because if you see it in terms of the bitterness, the different communities staying in different localities, continuous tension every time somebody has a prayer meeting, in festivals, the Hindu community leads a procession on one side, the Muslims lead that somewhere else. There's always been a period of friction. A lot of people get killed routinely in India with the Hindu-Muslim, and partly because of the impact of partition, so on. So the Hindutva is not a new story. What is new about it is that it has been cornered by people who have almost developed a priest-like lifestyle. For example, one of the reasons that Modi and the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, Yogi Aditya, is the fact that they are not married. They don't have children. So the issue is, how can we have a dynasty? We are totally committed to the country and to resurgence of our old civilization and so on. But on the other hand, what you find is that things are done legally. There are mobs, and this has always been part of Indian politics well before Modi ever came into existence. But They're very much there. The other response you get from there is say, well, you know, who are you talking about? You talk about the Chinese who are so popular in Indonesia, but look at the way they've treated the Muslim community in China, for example. So they don't talk about that. But in our case, we've been living together. We have large minority. It's not a small minority. I mean, you know, 170, 180 million people. It's a large minority. They've contributed tremendously to national life. And you know, and that's not going to change. And so I think this is one area that we need to look at much more carefully with the background of a partition, with the fact that the nature of Islam is quite different there compared to here, and so on. So this is something that you know, jury is out. But certainly purely on the propaganda side, it's everywhere in India. You'll see Modi's big face on you know, whether it's women's rights, whether it is the poor receiving their equivalent of bansos, it's all there. But the agenda in the end is to say, well, you know, they say, look, we're doing deals with the Saudis. We have got, we are very close to you know, many of the Middle Eastern countries. So if we were so anti-Chinese, why would we actually do that? So anti-Muslim, why would we actually do that? And so, you know, there's a lot of discussion about this, and I think you can't conclude from there that, you know, no cooperation is possible. Okay, the last point here is about the ASEAN issue. And there are two things here. One is that India definitely sees, from what I hear, tremendous merit in much closer business and political cooperation with ASEAN. But the Myanmar issue is now, and particularly the Rohingya issue and the migration to northeast India has become a very big local issue. And so then the question is, how do you really approach ASEAN? You know, and they all agree that the critical relationship in ASEAN is the relationship with Indonesia, because without that, you really can't talk too much about ASEAN. So that is a realization, and they would like to do whatever they can to thaw that. So I think that, you know, the final issue that I wasn't very competent to talk about, so I won't here, is their interest in much closer maritime security and the Indian Ocean region, policing, and so on and so on. But there are a lot of questions on that. But it was again a whole catalogue of exercises and trade in defense equipment and so on that we talked about. Okay, so that's basically, you know, an idea of where we are. Let me just summarize. There's 2 or 3 key insights that come out of this, and what can follow. The first is staggering lack of knowledge about each other. It's really quite dramatic, you know. For the Indians have no idea of how decentralized government works here. For us to have no idea of the fact that the Prime Minister of India can go on, you know, being elected 5 times around, and or the Indian civil service or whatever. So we have a massive deficit there. And clearly, without closing that, it's very difficult to have a conversation, because they assume, you know, their starting point is A and our starting point is B, and we don't know enough about each other to actually communicate. So closing that knowledge gap becomes very important. I think the second big issue is in terms of the business and complementarities. India has a tremendous capacity to help us diversify the Indonesian economy, but especially in terms of building up middle-level businesses. Pharma is one clear case. Education is another case. A number of agriculture technology is another case. Biotechnology, and so on and so on. So those are areas which meets our domestic agenda in the sense of creating a domestic business community which can diversify the economy, and it can also be a counterweight to any ethnic group that might be dominant in a way. So the Indians can be a very good partner with that. they can also be a very good partner in some of the governance issues. For example, in the exchanging experience about the civil service and helping to understand, systems of recruitment, promotion, etc. So both in the policy areas as well as in business, there are a number of areas where their skills are complementary to our needs, and I think we could fruitfully work together on that. Now, what do we do next? One issue that came up was that everybody in the places I visited suggested that there should be much more think tank to think tank, university to university, government department to government department linkages in order to close this knowledge gap, in order to identify where the complementarities were, and how to actually organize it. And of course, the capacity on both sides is very limited. Jawaharlal Nehru University is one of the best universities in India. There are 2 people there who know anything about Indonesia, and virtually nowhere else. So during this trip, I was offered many places, visiting professorships, just go and lecture about Indonesia. But so on one hand, there is this enthusiasm, there is curiosity, etc. On the other hand, there is this amazing lack of capacity. So I'd like to stop there. I'm sorry I've gone on for so long. But I think that what I would seriously recommend is that for Ibu Devi and a small team of people to actually visit India. This is something the Indians have also been saying. They said it very forcefully this time, is that, we should have teams of people visiting and see for ourselves, and the same from the other side. And maybe that's something that we should take up seriously. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra, for the presentation. It's very interesting, and you've provided a very comprehensive outlook on developments and differences that we need to take into account when we think about enhancing Indonesia and India relations. And of course, when we talked before the lecture, you spoke about how the topic that you covered can actually be discussed in 9 separate lectures. So it's really interesting how you managed to touch upon all of those issues in such a short time. But allow me to probe further into some of your points, especially in terms of India, ASEAN, and in particular Indonesia relations. And of course, you mentioned about how India being a rising power, and I understand this is something that the Indonesia audience understand as well, that Indonesia's growing confidence in sort of taking the leadership role in the global south, for example, has become even more obvious in the last couple of years, and especially with regards to ASEAN, to be specific. For example, 10 years ago, Modi launched the Act East policy, and of course, I believe that it is informed by the understanding that Indo-Pacific has become a more important region for India, and of course, Southeast Asia is a region that India cannot neglect anymore. So I was just wondering, departing from your points on how there are a lot of misunderstandings that needs to be resolved on both sides. To what extent have that policy changes within India helped in, for example, allowing for more exchanges and more and encouraging more understanding on both sides, especially after the Act East policy? To what extent has that helped improving India, ASEAN, and especially in the India and Indonesia relations?
Well, that's a great question, and that assumes that the Act East policy is actually effective and that it's been implemented in some kind of way. The Indians have been very good at talking about Look East, Act East, etc., where the structures have really not been set up to do that. There's some strange animal which still exists called BIMSTEC, right? Which almost sounds like a word of abuse, but it's not. It refers to direct neighbors, if you like. leaving out Pakistan. So again, there's been a lot of talk about this, but effectively, the Indians do not have a very tightly coordinated strategy for Southeast Asia. They're now beginning to do that, partly because their businesses are looking globally, and Southeast Asia is the nearest, and also because in terms of geopolitical alliances, particularly in relation to China, you know, Southeast Asia is a natural theater in a sense. So I think we still have to see what this Act East policy will actually mean. At the moment, it doesn't really have too much teeth, but I think there's a lot of thinking going on how they should function.
And in that sense, in terms of you've raised the point that beyond rhetoric, it hardly translates into anything at the practical level. But in terms of the reception within India, how has that in some sense helped the Indian, for example, the Indian business actors, for example, to expand their business in Southeast Asia? Has that translated into some sort of like meaningful progress in that area?
Yes, there are many, I think at the last count, I can't remember now, but there were 40 or 50 large businesses, Indian businesses in Indonesia. And of course the trade and investment, bilateral trade and investment is growing quite fast. So all that is true. But again, you know, this is not the same thing as a organized country-to-country engagement, which involves both the public policy as well as private players. And one of the things I kept on emphasizing in Delhi is that, you know, when the Americans want to come and do business in Indonesia, or indeed the French or the British or the Japanese or the Koreans or the Chinese, the governments and the private sector are very aware of what the other is doing. When the Indians come to Indonesia, it's, you know, the private sector comes despite the government and vice versa. There is absolutely no connection. And I remember I've had so many large delegations of the Indian Confederation of Industry, and the first briefing has been in my office. You know, they've actually come totally unprepared. And the embassy people have just been taking them around, you know, showing them Jakarta and who they should meet, and they have no idea who they are meeting. So in terms of entry strategy, in terms of preparation, all that is very weak. And so because there is a lot of interest, there is investment taking place, the people are visiting, and of course tourism now, etc. But it's not an organized policy at the moment that we can identify.
And maybe despite the lack of organization, as you were saying, if we were to, for example, look into the statistics, for example, in the last couple of years, ever since the pandemic, Indonesia and India trade in exchanges has increased immensely. For example, if I were to like tap into the statistics, the trade value between both countries has doubled in 2019 to 2023. So I was just wondering, despite the lack of organization that we mentioned, as well as the lack of understanding on both sides, what, in your observation and departing from your experience, what has contributed to such progress in between both their trade relations, for example?
Well, I think one is just complementarity. I mean, if you look at what we export and what we import and so on, this is clearly, the trade reflects that. And the trade is still skewed in terms of Indonesia, because we are exporting coal and exporting a lot of raw materials, etc., etc. And of course, we're also exporting palm oil and, you know, to India. All that is true, but what I feel that it's not, you know, what is driving this trade is, first of all, just the growth of the consuming class. You know, the number of consumers who actually have a surplus to buy, whether it is white goods or whether it is, you know, higher quality agriculture or cars or whatever, has increased dramatically. And that has created a large domestic market. And for many of the Indian firms who are very well known, for instance, there's a firm called Godrej in India. Godrej makes basically steel furniture, you know, and you will see this in Bollywood films, you know, they're everywhere. that people put all their saris and so on, and they can lock it nicely, and it's all, you know. Godrej is a big firm. They come to Indonesia, nobody's ever heard of Godrej. But when they come, they feel that everybody should have heard it. So they come because of the market, and the market's driving this thing, but it can do a lot more if they actually had you know, if it was within the framework of some kind of complementarity, they were given assistance. As part of our policy also to build up our industry in areas where, you know, so that we could actually have a domestic entrepreneurial class. I mean, it's really critical. So I think that's what happened here.
Speaking of trade as well, I understand that, I mean, if we were to speak about trade in ASEAN, I think it's difficult to not talk about RCEP as well. And in 2020, as you are aware, India pulled out of RCEP, which I understand that RCEP on one hand received a lot of rejections from the Indians, but at the same time, of course, I think one thing that ASEAN is quite disappointed about, because of course RCEP is something that ASEAN has been keen on pushing for years, and when it comes to leadership, for example, a lot of the ASEAN audience are worried that China might actually be taking the leading position in RCEP, and that sort of ties back into your point on how India has been quite keen on improving its leadership position in the region as well. So I was just wondering, what are your take on those? What are your take on India pulling out of RCEP, and or at the broader level in terms of like future engagement with ASEAN? What sort of engagement do both sides need to pursue moving on from this?
I mean, Ibu Devi is a much better expert than I am on some of these issues, but since you asked me the question, I'll try and fumble a reply. I think the first thing is really, you know, in a very broad sense, India is very much Indonesia's China card, you know, and vice versa, because you're really talking about any kind of very close relationship between India and Indonesia, actually, you know, Indonesia plus large part of ASEAN. You're really looking at close to 2 billion people and a market which is very fast growing, you know. And the whole point about a fast growing domestic market is that you do create new kinds of technology, you create new skills, you employ younger people, you have new startup firms like the Indians are now pushing hard to do, and so on and so on. So you create alternative centers of economic development and energy and urban growth, etc., etc. So I think that is true on both sides. The problem is that somehow we are carried away by, certainly the Indians now, who now feel that they have to play on the global stage. And so if China is the main competitor, then the enemy is a friend is an enemy, and a friend of a friend is a friend. You know, it's just that kind of situation. So the whole issue of pivoting towards the West. I mean, you know, for much of its post-independence existence, the Indians were very anti-American. Why? Because the Americans were supporting Pakistan. And on a political level, that was a no-no in India, partly because of the whole issue of partition and Kashmir and so on. So, you know, both sides can see this. And again, unless there is a structured and a reasonably long-term process to go issue by issue and build capacity to negotiate on these things, we are just going to be going round and round in this way and not getting far. You know, so I think the Indian stance is, we are a global power now, or we are an emerging power, and we have to play the global multipolar stage. So what is so special about Southeast Asia? You know, why not the Middle East? Why not Russia? Why not the BRIC countries, etc., etc.? So they are now thinking at that level. But the main challenge for them is in the neighborhood. I mean, it's between India and China. So I think that's what they would. That's where I see the difference in thinking.
And maybe to sort of course, I think the question that is looming now is, of course, the prospect of election, right? Because
yes.
Of course, we've just concluded our election last week, and of course, with quite an interesting result. And India as well, you will be having an election, and of course, as I mentioned before, I think most polls are saying that Modi will likely be re-elected for prime minister because BJP will likely win the election. And of course, I think given the fact that, for example, for Prabowo, a lot of his foreign policy narratives sort of, and a lot of his policy narratives at large sort of promotes continuity with what Jokowi has done in the last 10 years. And of course, with the fact that Modi will also, for example, will likely continue his leadership in India. What should audiences in both Indonesia and India anticipate in the coming years in terms of relations between both countries?
Nothing like easy questions in these things, you know. All right, well, let's start with the Indian elections, since the Indonesian ones have just taken place. Whatever happens in India is not going to be the clean sweep that Prabowo has had in Indonesia, I can tell you that. First of all, because India has a very large number of regional parties. I mean, here we have provincial party in Aceh, for instance, but it's not a common phenomenon. There, every single province has got its own regional parties, and many of them have actually been in government for, you know, continuously for several decades. And that's true of the south particularly, it's true of the east, and so on. So, but Modi, in order to be prime minister, really needs to have a majority in parliament out of 534 seats and so on. So, because there is not going to be a clean sweep across the south particularly, many of the, you know, the election results are not very encouraging. So it's going to be a lot of coalitions, even though Modi is very popular in the north and he has played the religious card, particularly the priesthood kind of, you know, he speaks in perfect Hindi, he doesn't use any Arabic words. I mean, there are all kinds of theater in the mannerisms and speech and so on. But it will be less stable in terms of ability to govern than what I suspect would be the case in Indonesia. Now, of course, one thing Modi does not have to worry about is the military. Whereas here, clearly, Prabowo's background, you know, raises a lot of questions about the military, etc. Now, and that's about the, you know, the possibility of the military coming back into politics, etc. But the other side of it is the human rights abuses and so on. Is the same for both of these characters. Modi also has a long history in Gujarat of during the Hindu-Muslim riots there, of taking when he was chief minister, of getting a lot of people killed, etc. Again, neither Modi nor Prabowo ever brought to court, and so, you know, you can't say, I mean, you can't have a trial by public opinion in this kind of context. So I think at one level, Modi will probably win. It will be quite a large victory in the north. There will be some losses in the south, but it will not be stable like the Indonesian situation. It will be much more marked by physical violence, which has only been the case there. And Indonesian democracy will, you know, come out looking a lot better. That's my guess in the whole thing.
Hopefully. But in terms of course, in terms of foreign policy, I think I'd just like to raise that recently Prime Minister Modi congratulated President-elect Prabowo for his re-election. I know it's too early to tell, but if you don't mind, could you please share on what sort of scenario can we anticipate in terms of foreign policy between and of course Indonesia-India relations in the upcoming 5 years?
Well, before I answer that question, can I just
Yeah, sure.
fill a gap a little bit, you know, in a way?
Yeah.
Because one of the things I presented in India, which immediately got people very excited, was a slide, which was slide 22 here, which says, Indonesia today, is it too good to be true? And I listed a number of things which I thought that would surprise them. For example, that it's a stable, multi-ethnic, highly decentralized democracy built in a matter of about 20 years. Uh, Slide 22.
Slide 22, please.
It's called Indonesia Today. Is it too good to be true? It's at this second bit where it says slides presented in India. Anyway, let me go down the list. So the first was that, first of all, Indonesia is a stable, multi-ethnic, highly decentralized democracy. Second, it's got robust economic growth with very low inflation rates. It's got very low levels of political and social violence. It's not facing a threat of radical Islam anywhere near what anybody had ever predicted. It's got an emergence of a large and fast-growing middle class, and that is fueling domestic demand growth. Indonesia is likely to become the fifth, and now people say fourth, strongest economy globally, and it's taking a much more active role in ASEAN. So for a country which only 20 years ago was under centralized military rule, this is quite a journey. And so the response immediately was, well, why is the level of political violence so low? Why is, what about, what drives high growth? Why is, they went through each of these, and a lot of questions about Islam without knowing that the Sunni-Shia divide didn't operate here, and so, and the general feeling was that really is quite exceptional, and they want to know a lot more about it. And I got repeated requests for them to put their think tanks in touch with some of ours to do joint work on some of these issues. So coming back to your foreign policy question, I think despite the posturing of pivoting to the West and all the rest of it, let alone if Donald Trump becomes president, this posturing about pivoting to the West will not go very far. I think in the Middle East, the Indians have legitimate interest because there is quite a large diaspora, particularly in the United Arab Republic and elsewhere. And there is a very large Indian Muslim population, so it's not surprising to me that, dealing with the Saudis is not as difficult. The Saudis have never taken a very strident kind of radical position in India anyway. So I think that probably, with a stable government on both sides, and as I say, Modi's won't be as stable as maybe what we may have here. There is likely to be much greater attempt at knowing much more about each other, having joint programs in a number of, but especially in education and IT and in digital technology, in medical, in biotechnology, the whole series of high-tech areas where I think there's going to be a lot more cooperation. And I also think that in terms of maritime security and policing the Indian Ocean region, there's going to be a lot more, because that's a direct interest of both of these. And I think that's a big change from where we have been in the past.
So a lot more cooperation and more enhanced cooperation between both sides. So that opens up a lot of interesting points for Q&A session. I would like to open up the floor for any question from the audience. And I see one hand there. Yeah, Sophie, please.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mishra, for the presentation. I think it is really interesting to know about how we can actually accelerate cooperation between India and Indonesia. But I'm intrigued with one point you have mentioned on in Islam and Hindutva and partitioned. And as we know as well, this past few years, Modi's policy has been, some of his policy has been deemed as anti-Islam or anything like that. I would like to know your take on this, especially how you see this as a challenge to accelerate India and Indonesia cooperation, and in general, maybe how you see this as a challenge on accelerating India and Muslim majority countries, relations between India and Muslim majority countries, regardless they are area, Middle East or Southeast Asia. What do you think about that?
Well, this is a question that is on everybody's mind, of course, when you look from outside. And one of the things which I note all the time is the fact that in order to judge what Modi is doing, you can only see it in this as to what is the normal in India and what Modi has done to that normal, in a sense, you know. And my understanding is that the Hindu-Muslim conflict in India is a very old one. There's never been a case where these communities have been, you know, living very happily together, and then somebody's come and, you know, totally changed the, you know. It's more of a matter of ratcheting up tensions that were already there than creating something terribly new. And of course, the scale is different because Modi has been in power for so long. He has a much larger majority. And also he's used the religious card very effectively, almost like Gandhi did. I mean, Gandhi used the religious card, you know, even though being very tolerant, etc., all the symbolism was very religious, you know. And so a lot of that is symbolism, because the same Modi then has huge investors conferences from all over the world in his home state in Gujarat, spends a huge amount of money promoting infrastructure investment, doing all the kind of things that we are doing here, right? And also, I think any sensible person in India, including Modi, of course, knows that you cannot have a situation where conflict is so high that involves it draws in all your Muslim neighbors. You know, I mean, just start counting from Pakistan to Bangladesh to Indonesia, you know, to parts of Philippines. If the Muslim world was united, you know, this would be a very serious kind of issue, right? And there's nothing for them to try and they don't get anything extra by that, because in terms of their own constituency, they've actually got that. And what Modi is now, what I understand, is that he wants to emerge as a global leader. He feels that the Indian bit is done now, you know. They somehow united the country behind some major programs, and you know, and there's a lot of rhetoric. In some regions, of course, it's quite severe on some particular issues, particularly this issue of building temples, etc. Now, the odd thing about the temple issue is that you can go on doing this forever, because the Muslims ruled India for over 300 odd years, 304. So depending on which bit of this cycle you prepare to stop, you will get complete different histories. You know, you could do the same with the British, for instance. You know, if all the Anglo-Indians in India started claiming boundaries when the British were there, you have a very different India. So I think that it's much more complicated geography than we think. And some Muslim majority provinces like Hyderabad doesn't have this problem. The problem happens in North India, between Muslim towns like Aligarh, Lucknow, and so on, which were all princely states, and you know, where the rulers were of very different kind of qualities. So again, the interesting thing about the Babri Masjid, which is the one where Ayodhya temple was built, is the fact that it was in court for 9 years. It wasn't just, you know, and there were occasional skirmishes, but it wasn't a case of a political party unleashing a huge militia and simply, you know, taking it over. They waited until the court decision, and that's true also. You know. So it seems to me that there is a lot more tension, but India has always, after partition, has had Hindu-Muslim tensions. Most of it has been concentrated in the border areas of Bengal, and then in the Pakistan side, Punjab, and so on. Right. I don't know how to read this. You know, when I look at it makes me laugh, because if you see some of the kind of ridiculous pictures that come out of the Ayodhya temple, where suddenly Modi seems to be a messenger of the god Rama to initiate a new period of what is called Ramraj, which means this ideal governance and so on and so on. And much of that is simply to get everybody to sing in one tune, but doesn't have too much development or political significance, it seems to me, you know. So my guess would be that over the next 3 or 4 years, you will see toning down of some of these things, so he's already got what he wanted. And the numbers are just too large. India does not have a minorities, you know, small Muslim minority. I mean, it's a very large Muslim minority. And there is no way that you would have a quasi-civil war in India if you started this. The partition will you know, pale into insignificance. So I think we have to be a bit careful from outside. You know, Modi plays the religious card very well, but he not only plays the religious card, he also plays the development card very well. You know, every major program now in India has got a very Sanskrit-sounding name. You know, like the self-reliance, but the Sanskrit word is rather a bit too pure. It's like going back to classical Sanskrit, you know, and so everything sounds like that. But in the end, what are you talking about? You're talking about giving digital, you know, startups to the poor, or giving food aid or whatever, you know. So I think out of that, I don't see India now suddenly becoming some kind of a Hindu military state. You know, this is far away from that. But it's very unpleasant, you know, and all my friends, you know, hate Modi, basically, you know. They say, you know, the press is curtailed, this, that, and the other is curtailed. But Indira Gandhi, for instance, actually created a state of emergency where thousands of intellectuals were arrested and beaten up and tortured in prison, you know, under the state of emergency. So it's not the first time. This is a regular occurrence in India. We are seeing it because Modi has now given this saffron coloring, you know, in the thing. So I don't think that this will be a major, and they themselves don't see it. If you see, I think they're right. If they were so anti-Muslim, it would be unthinkable for them to start having a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. You know, because that's the arch. You know, if you identify Islam with any country, it's got to be the Saudis. And the Indians are actually doing a lot of business with the Saudis and so on. So it's a very mixed picture, depending. It's a very opportunistic type of stance, and it's, you know, and it's dropped whenever necessary. So it's a bit difficult to assess, it seems to me, at the moment.
I believe we do have another question from Bu Devi.
Yeah, the issues of India and Indonesia is just so big, you know, you don't know where to start. There are just so many things going on. But there's this feeling of this frustrations that there's long time ago we were so close, and then we kept romanticizing the relations with each other, but then there's a lot of frustrations where it's not going fast enough. But I think that, you know, we need to be able to differentiate which areas we can really leverage our cooperation on. I was part of a recent webinar discussion, trilateral discussions, but under my other guys as FPCI, with Japan, GRIPS, and then various think tanks in India, talking about improving, you know, enhancing trilateral cooperation between India, Japan, and Indonesia in the wider security areas. And people are talking about make Quad plus 2, Quad 2.0, excluding a United States, which could possibly be under Trump, you know. So this is something that, you know, because the Quad 1.0 is totally unacceptable to ASEAN countries. Quad 2.0 is more wholesome with its widening of agenda and so on. And now and then, you know, there's a suggestion that, at least I make the suggestion that, you know, let's forget label. We just do de facto a lot of relationship. So there are several areas, you know, so this is not questions, you know, there are several areas in which Indonesia and Australia and India, or Indonesia, India and Japan, or Indonesia, India and Korea and so on. Or another different quote, Indonesia, India, Japan and Korea. Now, so there are so many other issues. Now here we keep talking about being a democracy. India as the largest democracy, and Indonesia third largest democracy. I was in South Korea recently, where we're talking about democracy, And the major democracies in the region were there, but one country was missing, and that was India. So India has never been very keen to talk about democracy as a project for regional or international cooperation. And I remember I was sitting in the Shangri-La dialogue when an Indian Minister of Defense, or Prime Minister was there at the time as one of the keynote speakers. And it was questioned one of the earlier crises of Myanmar. And we all tried to say, what can India do because of the border between India and Myanmar, and some importance attached by India to Myanmar. And now India is having relations with the junta, which is not in the interest of ASEAN at all. And then we say, what is India doing in this kind of things? And secondly, when we see democratic regression in Indonesia, in India, and globally, and with things like that, like the Habibie would like to look at partnering with, say, maybe think tanks in India to talk about, how can we talk together about democracy, how to strengthen the institutions of democracy, how to make democracy much more resilient, how to ensure women, for example. But very few in India is really interested in that kind of thing. So, there maybe we need to be able to sit down in which area, but given the fact that the Habibie Center's core is democracy building and promotion, do you think that it matters to India that it is actually not active in this area at all? Or would it want to change and be willing to ask? Because I don't think in these areas working with Western countries are going to be that helpful, because Western democracies have also lost its moral compass, especially what is happening globally and in Gaza and so on. And it's just the gap is wider and wider, and they're no longer seen as the light on top of the hill. But working with Asian countries which are also struggling with democracy, it can probably be much better for us, because we can learn from each other's mistakes as well as each other's successes. So I wonder whether you can give some idea in this.
Well, as usual, these are all the kind of questions that everybody wanted to ask, but never had a clear answer. But let me try. I think the problem with India is that they didn't have to struggle very hard for their democracy. They just inherited it. They didn't have any military rule that they had to overthrow. They didn't go through periods of national movement like in the time of Sukarno, the very polarized kind of situation. So, in a way, the Indian democracy just came at time of partition. They simply hooked on to the Westminster system. And because the Nehru dynasty was around for quite some time, they created some continuity. So they don't see democracy as a kind of issue that they should really go to bat for. It's almost taken for granted, And they're struggling with their own democracies, because they made also some major mistakes, particularly in their decentralization efforts. Nehru in '56 decided that provinces were going to be redrawn on linguistic basis. Because there were so many quite distinct languages and cultures and so on. And the result was that suddenly all these ethnic parties emerged, and who were very popular in provinces but didn't do too much in terms of stability of government and so on. So I think in a way they haven't had to aspire for democracy in the ways that we do here or many other countries. So there isn't a sort of connect in that sense. They think this is a domestic issue, and as long as it's some form of public participation and stable elections and so on, then what else can they actually add? But on the other hand, in terms of individual think tanks and so on, actually part of the problem is that we don't really have a good audit of the different think tanks that actually exist in India, and there are thousands of them. And also, the think tanks in the south are quite different to the ones in the north. So I think that if one does a bit of research on this, it is quite possible to have a number of quite high-profile think tanks who are still very independent and do talk a lot about democracy, but particularly about human rights and oppression against women and corruption in the civil service or the courts, all of which are sort of bits and pieces that we associate with good governance and democratic structure. So I think partly it's we need to search a bit more because we are, in a way, we don't have enough information. And then also to see who's actually there, because many of the Indian activists are still very prominent, and they have a national audience and an international audience. So I think a bit of research on that, it should be possible to have, maybe 8 or 10 think tanks in India who one can connect with, and can have that kind of discussion.
And I think that really links back to your earlier point on how it is very important to not only bridge the differences, but also bridge the knowledge gap on our understanding on both sides. And that, of course, nicely conclude our discussion for today. I would like to, first of all, thank Dr. Mishra for your participation in discussion, and please give another round of applause to Dr. Mishra. And thank you very much for the questions from the audience. It has been very, very enlightening to hear your questions and responses from Dr. Mishra as well. And that concludes our discussion for today. Thank you very much for our audiences who are present both offline and online. And we look forward to seeing you on our next public lecture. Thank you very much.